Hey, what's up, everyone? This is your Felony Friday host, John Odermatt. Before we get started with today's show, I want to tell you about another podcast. Not another libertarian podcast, but an entertaining podcast, one that's focused on reality TV, trash TV, and it's hosted by some familiar hosts. It's myself, Brian McWilliams, and the elusive legal counsel of the Lions of Liberty, Rico. Now, the three of us are doing the things that men around this world need done. Of course, if you're a husband or a boyfriend or whatever, you've probably been forced to watch trash reality TV with your significant other. So what do? We break it down, we drink beer, we talk about these shows, we tear these shows apart, we talk about everything ridiculous going on with these insane people, and we have some fun while we're doing it. So tune in. You can find Bravo and Beer. That's the name of the show. I don't know if I said that. Bravo and Beer. You can find that wherever podcasts are found. And you don't even have to watch these shows. I mean, it's great if you do. You can just tune in and enjoy the hilarity. All right, Bravo and Beer. Check it out.
Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers, welcome back to another edition of Felony Friday, a weekly show right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. Felony Friday is one of three shows. We got our Monday show hosted by Mark Claire, where Mark's talking to entrepreneurs. He's talking to leaders in the libertarian movement. We got Wednesday, Electric Liberty Land, hosted by Brian McWilliams. It's comedy, culture, liberty, insanity. It's fantastic. Check it out. Get all three of these shows by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. Please do it. And after you subscribe, after you listen, and especially if you've been a long-time listener, please leave us a 5-star rating and review. And even better, even if you don't listen using Apple Podcasts, do it there, because they have the most influence and the most downloads, and you get on the charts. So please go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, leave us a 5-star rating, and you can even put a question that you want us to talk about on this show. We have another episode coming up soon where we're going to address questions like that. So leave us a question, whatever you want to ask us, and we'll do a special show to be announced where we answer questions from reviews. So I want to turn towards today's episode. I have another interview with an inmate on death row. We're going to be talking first with Tessie Castillo, who is the co-author, and really the driving force behind the Crimson Letters, and another co-author from the Crimson Letters, Lyle May, who is on death row. So we'll be talking with Tessie first, then Lyle. You don't want to miss this interview, guys. All right, let's get right to it. Okay, today on Felony Friday, we have another interview with an inmate who is on death row, Lyle May. He is also a co-author of the Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. And a couple weeks ago, we spoke with really the force behind that book, the creator of that book, and a co-author of the Crimson Letters, Tessie Castillo. And we're going to welcome her back today before we are joined by Kyle. Tessie, welcome back to Felony Friday.
Thanks for having me back again.
Well, thanks for coming back on the show, and I'm not going to, make you rehash your interview from last time, but just for those who maybe didn't hear that, and I will encourage everyone to go back and listen to that. I think that was 2 weeks ago, and I'll link to that on the show notes page, of course. But for those that didn't hear it, what is the Crimson Letters? What is the book, and what's the reason that really initiated and inspired you to write it?
Sure. So I was granted an extraordinary opportunity in 2014 to teach a writing class to men on death row in North Carolina in Central Prison. And I was so moved by what I saw there inside the prison and by their writing that I wrote a letter to a local newspaper advocating for their humanity. And for that, my class was canceled. So Crimson Letters is a response to that. I reached out to several of my former students and asked if they would be willing to put together a book. And the essays within Crimson Letters describe how they got to prison and also the level of growth and self-reflection that they've done since they've been there as they search for meaning and purpose, even under a death sentence.
So I know when we talked last time about the reaction, and maybe you thought the audience was a little bigger than you anticipated. And really, I mean, to be honest, it doesn't surprise me that it's getting that people want to read it and it's getting a good response. But for people out there who maybe are thinking about buying it, but haven't pulled the trigger yet, why should somebody choose to read The Crimson Letters?
I think especially now with what we're going through in our country, this period of upheaval, it's more important than ever that we understand the things that unite us as people and don't always focus on the divisions. And that's what Crimson Letters really does, is it shows you, I mean, you're reading about people on death row who've been through experiences that are very different than most of us have ever been through, but you'd actually be surprised at how much in that book will resonate with you, how much you can relate to that these men have been through.
Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, it's, and I think I said last time that, with these stories, I mean, obviously for people who aren't in prison or haven't done time in prison, or even they may not even know anybody who's been to prison. So you might think there's no way that you can possibly relate to it. But even just taking sort of, motivation and inspiration from their stories, from their attitude, how they're able to take this situation that they're in where they're in prison on death row and still find a way to turn it around and, find a way to positively contribute to society, which I think is just amazing. And I mean, that alone is worth the read in my eyes. I want to ask you one more question here before we get Lyle on the phone. And I don't think I asked you this last time, but throughout the process of pulling this book together and, writing your pieces and editing and, corresponding back and forth with the inmates on their pieces, what is the biggest thing that you really learned about yourself through this process? Something that, prior to it, maybe you thought you weren't capable of, or something that you overcame?
Mm-hmm. This whole process from the very beginning has been a long learning curve about learning how to confront my own fears and my own doubts. There's a lot that I was afraid of in writing this book. I was afraid of how people would respond. I was afraid about whether I wanted to pigeonhole myself as someone who speaks on the death penalty. I was afraid, and I'm still afraid, about potential retaliation against my co-authors from the prison. And if they do retaliate, just the guilt that I would feel, having known that it was my actions that caused that retaliation. And so every day is kind of a struggle to try to overcome that fear and to dig really deep and find courage. So that was something surprising about myself. And also, there were so many points throughout this process where I almost gave up. And there were points where my co-authors almost gave up or did give up in some cases. We did lose one of the co-authors in this process. There were originally 5. So it's just, digging deep again and keep going a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And the fact that we even published this book at all is still amazing to me. I just look at it sometimes and I think, wow, it's really there. It really That's happened. Awesome. I didn't think that it would.
Yeah, it's one of those things, you put so much work into it, you're moving along and you have your eyes set on the goal. And then when you're there, you're like, wow, how did I do that?
Yeah.
But I'm also curious with writing this book, and this is something that I deal with. I've never spent time in prison. I have had, relatives and people who have, and that's one of the reasons that got me involved and sort of inspired me to start this show. But do you ever feel, because I feel this personally, a little bit of imposter syndrome, talking about these things, not having the personal experiences?
Yes. And that's why I always invite my co-authors to do the interviews with me. Mm-hmm. I sort of consider myself a conduit for them. They need me to help organize these things and email the necessary people to be able to set up interviews and to set up events. But they're the stars of the show, and that's the way that it should be.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you overcame any imposter syndrome that you had, because without you, this book wouldn't have happened. So being a conduit, I think, is equally as important as these stories themselves, because we wouldn't hear these stories unless you had taken the risk and gone out there and actually, put this book on paper. So thank you for that.
No problem.
All right, so we are going to get Lyle on the phone. Hey, let's take a real quick commercial break. I want to tell you about a great coffee company, Lorenzotti, Italy. This is a company started by libertarians, two guys, Robert and Zach. They couldn't be more different, but they both love coffee. And they love that experience of that small, independent coffee shop. They actually love it so much that not only are they a coffee company that sells delicious coffee, but they help entrepreneurs and coffee enthusiasts set up their own business with equipment and financing and all that stuff. So what you can do to help them out and to help us out a little bit is you can go to lorenzotti.coffee. That's .coffee, not .com, and enter discount code LIONS for 10% off your order. Check it out at Lorenzotti, Italy. Coffee is their passion. They're just two guys who want to bring an excellent coffee to the U.S. and make business easier and more profitable for the passionate entrepreneurs who provide the best coffee experiences for their patrons. Check it out, lorenzotti.coffee. Enter promo code LIONS for 10% off.
Can you hear us, Lyle?
Yep.
How's it going, Lyle?
How's it going?
Okay, so you guys just heard from Tessie Castillo. I want to thank her again for coming on the show and the work she's done with the Crimson Letters and really pulling all of this together, facilitating this interview today. She has helped me to bring Lyle May on the show. Lyle was convicted of double homicide in 1999 at the age of 19. He's currently on death row in North Carolina. While he's been incarcerated, he's managed to earn his GED, his associate's degree. He's also published 2 books and is working on a third. He's written articles for the Marshall Project, the J Journal, Prison Writers, and maintains a blog at beyondsteeldoors.com. Lyle, welcome to Felony Friday.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show. And I started off with this question last time with your co-author, and I'm going to ask you this same question first. When you went through your trial and you first heard your sentence, that you were sentenced to death row, to a death sentence, what was that initial reaction like for you? What was that like emotionally to hear that read?
Well, I was still in a kind of a state of shock from the conviction, the guilt innocence phase, and by the time that they'd actually gone through sentencing and read the verdict, it was just one of shock. There was, you often hear or see on TV the reporting about people who go through these trials, and the comments are always something along the lines, "Oh, he looks stone-faced," or "he's not showing any emotion." Well, that's generally because those people are in shock. It's not an ordinary situation, and it's hard to process not only all of the information that goes on at trial and the different testimony and the arguments and trying to keep up with all of that, but then, to process this idea that you are being ripped away from your loved ones and put in prison, not just in prison, but in prison to die. It's difficult to get over. It's not the kind of thing that you just suddenly understand. It takes years to really process that capital trial, and it did that for me. So in that particular moment, as the sentence was read, I was in a state of shock.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's a good point you bring up. People see these faces, and you make assumptions on, how are they not reacting? But Yeah, that makes total sense. That you'll be in complete shock at that point in time. So you've been on death row for 20 years now, I guess. How over that
plus.
21? Sorry. How has your attitude evolved over that time? You said it took you a couple years. What's that journey been like for you?
It's been long, and my attitude's evolved significantly, and I don't think I can quite express how much it's changed. When I first fell and went through that process of trying to understand how I'd gotten here and what that exactly means, it didn't suddenly dawn on me like, oh, gee, I need to change my ways. That was certainly part of the process, but at the same time, it's like, figuring out like a shattered glass. You have to kind of examine each piece and figure out where it fits with the other and kind of put it back together to get an idea of what being made whole looks like. And as you're doing that, you're kind of discovering what your failings are and what your strengths are too. And when you do that, you kind of have to make a choice. You make a choice to say, okay, well, just because I've been broken doesn't mean I can't be put back together. And when you make that decision, you have to recognize that the responsibility, or I should say the accountability for being made whole, for evolving and changing, lies with you, or I should say with me, in terms of becoming a better person, in terms of educating myself, in terms of becoming spiritually awakened, in terms of understanding the criminal legal process. And as you go along and time passes and you slowly put the pieces back together, you discover a lot of things. For me, it was that I enjoy writing. I find that writing is a way of seeing, and as I grow better at it, it becomes an accurate way of seeing, not just my life, but the lives of others around me and of this place that I'm in. And as I see the different problems that are within this system, that are within the lives of those around me, that are within my own life, I look for solutions, because I'm once you reach a point where you've educated yourself and you discover this way of seeing, you don't just want to leave things broken. You want to try to put them back together. You want to fix them. You want to find solutions for these various issues that you see, and you go at them. And that's kind of how I've developed my time and my attitude toward that time.
Yeah, I've read some of your work, and I've read your writing, and it's excellent. And to talk about in the one article I read how, I think you talked about you said you dropped out of high school when you were a sophomore, and you really never even, got into reading and writing back then. I wanted to ask you, what were some of the books or some of the authors that that either are your favorite authors or kind of motivated and pulled you towards, learning how, farthering your own writing style?
The first book that I can say honestly jumped out at me early on in my incarceration was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And it has been, on multiple occasions, instrumental in evolving my thinking and my approach to incarceration. Frankl essentially teaches that suffering is universal, and just as universal is our ability to find meaning in that suffering and to make it worthwhile. I say that in the sense that, again, it goes back to this idea of holding yourself accountable every day for your time on this earth and making that time meaningful and bringing purpose to it. And that's kind of the core lesson that I took away from Frankl early on in my life. I didn't early on in my incarceration, didn't totally grasp it at the beginning. It's something I had to kind of grow into. It's like wearing a pair of pants that are just a little bit too big for you right then and there, but you grow into them. You roll the legs a little bit, and you make the best of it. But Man's Search for Meaning was certainly a key book early on.
I'll have to check that out. I have not read that. I wanted to ask you about your own writings, your own books. So you've written 2 books. Could you tell us a little bit about those books and the story behind them?
Well, the first book, Waiting for the Last Train, was kind of my first real foray into essay writing and memoir writing. I wrote it kind of at the suggestion of my mom. She wanted me to just sit down and write my story in the way that I understood it. And I did that. I, did my best to do that. And it was kind of more of an overview than a really deeply detailed story. It carried me through some of the more vivid memories of my childhood and not necessarily the best ones. So it's kind of imbalanced in that way, and it seems very negative. And that was something that was brought to my attention early when both of my parents read it. But it was also, again, I mentioned writing as a way of seeing. It was also helpful and cathartic in many ways. And it awakened in me a desire to continue writing, to really dig into the hard work of understanding myself, my past, my present, and my future.
Yeah, writing can be powerful, and getting those words on paper. That's not surprising that it helped you through this difficult time. I did want to talk to you, and we'll come back. I have some more questions about your time in prison, but I want to shift for a minute here and talk a little bit about just the criminal justice system. I know that you've written a lot about criminal justice reforms. So could you share with us some of the reforms that you are most passionate about, that you have written about or advocated for the most?
Sure. I'll share a story with you. Recently, the North Carolina Racial Justice Task Force that was convened by the State Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls and Attorney General Josh Stein held a public meeting in which they were soliciting public comment about ways to address racial injustice and the criminal injustice system. I took an opportunity to submit 4 proposals to that task force, and they did, in fact, receive them. And those 4 proposals are these. The first was to commission an ombudsman's office that would oversee conditions of confinement in North Carolina prisons and jails, kind of act as an intermediary between the prison population and prison officials. The second proposal was to establish a rehabilitative mandate.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
In every North Carolina prison, and that's namely to make sure that mental health, vocation, and higher education programs are implemented in every facility. The third was to create a second look mechanism that grants the North Carolina Parole Commission and post-release supervision the authority to review any kind of life sentence for people who have served a minimum of 25 years. And the fourth was simply to...
You have 30 seconds remaining.
...to abolish the death penalty. And those proposals have been received, and they're currently being reviewed, and hopefully in December, when they submit the report to the governor, they'll be included.
Is it right that in North Carolina there is no parole?
Yes and no, and I'll explain that on the second call.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay, Lyle. Yeah, back to back to that question. I asked you about North Carolina, the situation with parole there.
Right. So in October of 1994, the North Carolina Sentencing Commission changed the law and abolished parole for crimes committed after October of 1994. For crimes that had been committed before that date, there is still parole. An example of this I wrote of in Paroling Michael Pinch, an article that was published by Scalawag magazine, and it explained how my friend Michael had been convicted of a double homicide in 1978. Well, the laws back then were different. First-degree murder was a parole-eligible sentence after with a life when you've done a minimum of 20 years on a life sentence. Well, he had been incarcerated for nearly 41 years, I think, before earning parole earlier this year. And that is just one example of people who have been sentenced for crimes that were committed before October 1994. For people who have been convicted of crimes that occurred after October of 1994, there is no parole. And that's largely put because parole was abolished by the Parole Commission, and they implemented what's called the Structured Sentencing Act, which creates mandatory minimums and only a little bit of time off of a sentence for good behavior, or what's called a mandatory minimum. And that's it. That's really the only difference.
Yeah, that jumped out to me, and I forget which of your writings I was reading. I did not know that about the North Carolina parole situation. I'm curious, what's the status of your case? Do you have appeals that are left, or what would be your path towards, eventually getting released or getting, I guess, paroled yourself?
The only thing that I can say, and I have a very mean lawyer who will jump on me if I say otherwise, is that I am contesting my conviction and sentence, and I am still currently under appeal and cannot say anything else. Gotcha.
That makes sense. I won't ask you any more questions about that. I did want to come back to your time that you've been serving in prison for the past 21 plus years. If you could take us through what a normal day in prison is like for you.
For me, a normal day in prison is full of reading and writing and finding ways to stay focused on a number of tasks that I give myself. And I do my best to give myself an overwhelming amount of tasks so that I never lack for something to do. It helps me stay busy, and it's good to be as busy as, really needing extra hours in a day, even in prison. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but that's the kind of stuff that I like to do, whether it's writing articles for Scalawag magazine, whether it's creating new chapters for the book I'm working on, Class of One, The Transformative Journey of Higher Education in Prison, or completing my college courses or applying for new college courses. There's always something to do, something to schedule, somebody I need to talk with, a professor I need to consult with. And I prefer my time that way. I think I would probably lose my mind if I didn't have those sorts of things to do. And there have been plenty of people in prison and that are in prison now losing their minds because there is nothing to do and they don't have access to that higher education and kind of the programs that I've established for myself over these years.
That's really interesting. I think that's good advice. When you talk about giving yourself an overwhelming amount of things to do, maybe that's not good advice for everyone. Maybe a lot of people will get overwhelmed, but that's something I try to do myself personally. The problem is sometimes, you'll lose track of something, or something will fall through the cracks, and you'll kind of beat yourself up over it. After it, if you set a deadline for yourself, you don't meet it. So I'm curious, how do you keep yourself on tracks? How do you prioritize what you want to work on that day?
That's actually a really good question, because I'm struggling with that now. I have, I guess you'd say, a vision board, which is kind of a finessed version of a dry erase board. It's a piece of plastic trash bag that's taped to my wall that I use washable markers on, and I track all of my lessons for the courses I'm enrolled in. I track the chapters that I'm writing for my book. I track speaking engagements like this one for Lions of Liberty, and the two that I have coming up for Columbia University. I make sure that all of my dates are accurate and times are written down, and I stay as organized as I possibly can. And even then, I still manage to fall behind sometimes because, I just need a breathing room. And when those times occur, I'm working on being more gentle with myself, but that's a work in progress.
That's amazing. So you're keeping track of your tasks on you said a trash bag that you have taped up to the wall. That takes away any excuses that anyone in the outside world makes for themselves for keeping track of things and losing track of things. That's awesome to hear. So I did want to come back again to reform for a minute here, or however long it takes, and kind of get a little more specific. I know you read through your proposals there, which was great. But if you could kind of imagine a world where you're put in charge of the prison system, what reforms would you put in place with regards specifically to educational programs, and or with regards to personal development programs?
I think there is a misunderstanding that by establishing a rehabilitative mandate, it necessarily costs money. That's not always the case, or at least it's only part of the case. Immediately, the thing that could change overnight that would be absolutely free is the way prison officers are trained to treat people in prison. They too often look at them like property. And when you have that mindset, when you don't see the people who are under your charge as in need of rehabilitation, then you're not going to treat them like they need rehabilitation. And that becomes a problem, because then you generate animosity, and you see a lot of what you often hear about in the news. And just simply by training prison officers to more ably respond to their charges, as human beings, it would change significantly and go a long way toward helping to establish a rehabilitative ideal. And then you have to fund it. You have to fund higher education. You have to fund vocation, and you have to make it a mandatory requirement. This is not something that can be optional. And I say that, but sometimes there has to be forced use. And in this instance, people who are in prison need to be habilitated before they can be rehabilitated, and that habilitation comes through education.
So at what point in your own journey, just to get a little bit more specific, I know we talked about your evolution, but can you point to like a specific moment in time where your attitude changed, where something clicked for you, and you decided you wanted to change your course and start reading more, start writing?
It was maybe around 2007 that I had taken about the fifth course from UNC Chapel Hill, and I clung to the idea that this is something that saved me from ordinary prison life. It opened my mind in ways that I've never even considered before. It's hard to think, it's hard to imagine and dream if you don't have the fuel to do so. And higher education provided that for me. And once it did, I couldn't ever see leaving it. I couldn't ever see not having it. And once that had clicked over my mind, and I went to my sponsor, and I'm like, hey, look, I'm not going to stop doing this. Would you be willing to let me switch universities and pursue a degree program. I would like it to mean something beyond me just doing courses and learning for the intrinsic value, and he agreed. And I switched to Ohio University and haven't looked back. That, I believe, is the moment at which I left prison life behind, that I left any old ideas that I might have clung to, that I couldn't do it, or that I was incapable or incompetent, because there was proof otherwise. And the grades I was earning, the comments from professors I was receiving, and that was the proof.
Something you said there just jumped out to me, and if you could elaborate on it. You said you left prison life behind. What does that mean for you? Prison
is a place where choice still occurs on a daily basis. There are a lot of things that you can do that can get you in trouble. It's really easy to step outside of the rules because there are so many. But if you have kind of your own path, if you have your own sense of purpose, then those things no longer matter. You're no longer interested in the day-to-day gossip, using substances to take your mind away from, your responsibilities. There is, I guess, more intent in your daily living by removing yourself from prison, from the idea of, what it means to become institutionalized. And you begin to think critically. And I think that more than anything else is what has separated me from a lot of people in here, is that ability to think critically. And I wish more than a lot of things that I could extend that to other people, to show them how to think critically. And if I could, I would certainly teach them.
Yeah, that's profound. If that's something that could somehow be bottled up, I think that would solve a lot of problems, not only in prisons but around the world. Because I think there's a lack of critical thinking. We have an epidemic throughout this world. I did want to ask you a little, maybe a more deeper question. So I know you've put a lot of time into your writing. You've written 2 books. You've been a co-author with Crimson Letters. You're working on another book. You're doing the speaking engagements, and you've just talked about, leaving prison life behind and, having the influence beyond the prison walls. How do you want to be remembered for your time on earth? When people look back on your life, what do you want them to say about you?
That I lived life the second time as I should have the first.
What do you mean by that?
That once I discovered the importance of education, once I was granted that first opportunity, that I never let an opportunity pass me by again, that I, from then on, did the absolute best I could every time. That in doing,
you have 60 seconds remaining.
I was able to prove my potential as a human being and continue striving.
Well, that is powerful stuff, Lyle. And we have a couple seconds left here. Do you have any parting words, any advice, anything you'd like to say to my audience before I let you go?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And I would like people to remember, who listen to this or who...
You have 30 seconds remaining. ...about
people in prison, that they're human beings first, that prisons are a responsibility of the public, and just because you don't see us does not mean that responsibility goes away.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Lyle, and I appreciate everything you're doing, appreciate your attitude, and appreciate your contribution here to the criminal justice reform movement.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it.
Hope you guys enjoyed that episode of Felony Friday. Another awesome episode. Just want to remind everyone before you get going here, off to your next podcast, or your shuffle, or whatever it is you're doing with your day today. I want to thank you for giving me your time and listening to this interview. I want to ask you, please, to share this with a friend. The only way that we're going to expand this message, that we're going to reform this criminal justice system, is by sharing interviews just like this with your network. Very easy to do. And I also want to ask you to please, if you have not yet checked it out, you need to go to the Lions of Liberty store. It's lionsofliberty.store. We have a bunch of new t-shirt designs, really interesting stuff, really eye-catching designs. Of course, our taxation is death shirt has been a hit. It's selling like crazy. We now have the tax on, wax off shirt. Just awesome. And there's more coming. We're really trying to get into what we're calling it the Lions of Liberty brand of shirts. So you're going to get the cool design on the front, and then up just real small up by the tag on the back, you're going to have our Are You Ready to Roar logo. We're trying to, take another angle here and influence people through, some snazzy t-shirts. So check it out, lionsofliberty.store. And remember, if you're in the Lions of Liberty Pride, you get 20% off. So for as little as $5 a month, you're going to get 20% off all your t-shirt orders. So to join the Pride, go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And with that being said, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Have a great weekend or week or whenever you're listening to this. Just have an awesome day. I'll talk to you next week. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.